Thanks a lot for inviting me. It's great to be here. I teach the macroeconomics class in the business school. So what I want to talk about today is something that's been in the news a lot recently, which is fiscal stimulus. So fiscal stimulus is something that had sort of died as a topic of conversation in the policy world until recently. The reason was that people had predominantly come to the view that we should be using tools like monetary policy as opposed to tools like fiscal policy. But then in the recent interest rate environment where we hit the zero lower bound, fiscal stimulus really came back as a major topic of conversation. And of course, there's the recent $1 trillion American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which is the largest plan of its type since the Great Depression. So as you probably know, there's a wide range of views on the efficacy of fiscal stimulus. So in particular, what I want to talk about today is a concept called the fiscal multiplier. So the government spending multiplier, the fiscal multiplier, in particular the government spending multiplier is what I'm going to talk about, is the answer to the question, what happens to GDP if you increase government spending by 1% of GDP? So the question is, suppose I increase government spending by 1% of GDP, by how much, by what percent will GDP increase? And there's a huge range of views on what this is, ranging from the Obama administration and economists such as Paul Krugman, that the multiplier is pretty high, so something in the range of 1 or 2. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are people that think the multiplier is close to 0. So why is there so much disagreement on this crucial question from a policy perspective in the recent period? Well, we know that economists disagree on a lot of things. But I would say on this issue, there's a particularly huge amount of disagreement. One reason is that there's very different implications of different types of views of the economy in terms of what you think the government spending multiplier will be. So on the one hand, you have sort of a Keynesian perspective that a lot of fluctuations in the business cycle are driven by fluctuations in aggregate demand. And if the reason why you're in a recession is because aggregate demand is low, then there's an idea that you could increase aggregate demand by increasing government spending. So that would be a view that would suggest a large government spending multiplier. On the other hand, there's a neoclassical view, which is that most of the fluctuations in the economy are driven by supply-side factors, economic fundamentals like productivity. And according to that view, well, increases in government spending, assuming that they're not going to lead to huge changes in productivity and so on, at least in the short run, they're not going to affect these economic fundamentals. And so as a consequence, they're not going to have a big impact on the amount that the economy produces. So in fact, what will happen according to this view is that the increase in government spending, holding the amount that the economy actually produces fixed, will actually just crowd out private consumption and private investment. So that's a totally different view of how government spending affects the economy. And one of the reasons why there hasn't been sort of a resolution in terms of what the right view is of the economy when it comes to the effects of government spending is that it's very hard to study this empirically. So the fundamental difficulty is that as we've seen in the recent period, government spending doesn't just happen randomly. So when do we see a huge fiscal stimulus? Of course we see it when there's a major problem in the economy. So these aren't random times. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the government spending we saw during the Great Depression, these are not, these are not things that are random. So just running a regression or looking at the correlation between government spending and output is not going to give us the right answer. So just to give you an example of this, suppose I wanted to argue that the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was not effective. Would it be a convincing argument if I were to just say, well, look, unemployment is high, so it can't have been effective? No, it's not really a convincing argument because you don't know what the counterfactual is. So the basic difficulty is, and it could be that things would be much worse if not for this fiscal stimulus. So that's the fundamental difficulty. How do we deal with the problem that government spending doesn't happen randomly and could be correlated with other things that are happening in the economy that would have caused growth to be low anyway? So the problem is that we can't run experiments. So if economists could play God and run experiments, and we wanted to learn about this question from that perspective, what would we do? We would randomly have huge, fiscal stimulus plans at different points in time, and then we would see what happened to the economy, and then we would get an answer to this question. Problem is, of course, that we can't do that. So what do people do instead? Well, one approach is to view wars as exactly that kind of experiment. Perhaps we can view large wars as essentially unrelated to the state of business cycle, and then think about how they affect the economy. And so that's one approach that's been used in the literature. And there's, again, sort of a wide range of estimates, but ranging from something like 0.5 to 1.5. Of course, one of the difficulties with looking at wars is there just aren't that many large wars, unfortunately, from the perspective of learning about something like this. Another approach is to use econometric methods, where you just try to control in some way for the other factors that you think might affect economic growth aside from government spending. But of course, the difficulty with that is there's always a question as to whether you're really controlling for everything. So what is our take on this problem? Well, we're going to try to use in our research project, what we did was we tried to use military procurement spending as a way of getting a sense of the effect of government spending on output. And in particular, we're going to use military procurement spending at the level of individual states or individual regions. So you don't want to use military procurement spending, all of the variation in military procurement spending at the level of states. And the reason is that state-level military procurement spending is notoriously political. So there's a huge amount of evidence that there's a lot of political jockeying about who gets military procurement contracts. And so it's reasonable to think that, for example, it might be easier to get this kind of contract when, for example, your state is in a recession. And then you would be back to exactly the same problem as I described at the beginning with government spending in general. But a slightly more nuanced way of looking at it is to think about the fact that when the US goes into a war or military buildup, the different states don't all benefit to the same extent in terms of government spending. So there are some states which have systematically more sensitivity in terms of the amount of government spending that they receive to military buildups or wars than other states. So in other words, when the US goes into a war, there are some states that just aren't affected at all, basically. But there are other states which have, for example, they build submarines or missiles or whatever, where there's a huge effect on that state's economy. And so this is the type of experiment that we're going to use to ask the question, what does it look like happens to these economies when they receive this disproportionate increase in military spending that's associated with these large wars? So that's the approach that we use to try to think about this question. One thing that helps us in carrying out this research project is that probably because of the huge amount of political sensitivity of this military spending, the government keeps incredibly good tabs on what happens to military procurement spending. So you can get data at the level of individual contracts to individual companies and find out how much military procurement spending there was at a very localized level. And so that's the kind of data that we're going to use. One concern that you might have is that we're going to see from what company the government is buying things. I mean, this military procurement spending is all sorts of things, ranging from like missiles to construction and so on. But you might worry that this isn't really going to represent where the product is being produced, because to some extent there might be an issue that maybe the company is headquartered in one place, but the production is taking place somewhere else. But here again, we're helped by the fact that the government keeps really good tabs on this industry. And so in fact, there's another set of data which allows us to look it's basically a survey of plants, which allows us to look at where the production is taking place and the shipments from individual factories to the government. And it turns out, so this is a graph showing these two different sources of data. The black line, which we have over a longer time period, is this military procurement spending. And the gray line is what we see from the shipments data from these different plants. It turns out that these things line up really, really closely. So the type of data, the type of information we're going to use is we're going to use a time series like this. So this is military procurement over the time period 1966 to 2006. And we're going to ask a question like, when aggregate military spending goes up, like associated with the Carter-Reagan military buildup, for example, we see that military spending is much more sensitive in California than it is in Illinois. And then we're going to ask the question of whether we think that, or whether we see that growth increases more in California relative to Illinois. And that's going to be our approach to getting an estimate of this government spending multiplier. So aside from looking at individual states, we can also look at regions. And in some sense, maybe this is a little bit more comparable to looking at countries. We can divide the US up into into 5 different regions. These regions of the US are sort of roughly comparable in size to a mid-sized European country. So sort of that might be the most proximate comparison to what we're looking at, what happens if there's a big increase in government spending in a country that's part of the European Monetary Union. And then, as I said, what we're going to do is we're going to ask the question, associated with these military buildups, when we see a relative increase in government spending in one place relative to another place, how much do we see output increase in one place, in the first place versus the second place? What we find is that our estimate of this fiscal multiplier, which I'm referring to as the relative fiscal multiplier because of the fact that it's one state or one region relative to another, is about 1.5. So what does that mean? That means that when we see government spending as a fraction of GDP going up by 1% in one region or one state versus the other, we're seeing output go up by about 1.5%. So thinking back on these numbers that I showed you at the beginning, this is actually a pretty high number relative to a lot of the statistics I showed you from wars and other aggregate experiences. So this is, you know, at first glance, this is going to seem sort of like very much on the Keynesian side of the estimates that have been presented in the literature. But there's an important aspect of how you interpret this. So when we first started working on this, we thought that the fact that we were going to look at states or regions as opposed to looking at the US as a whole was sort of a disadvantage. Because, you know, what we're really interested in is the question of what happens if the US as a whole increases government spending, and maybe we're only getting at it in sort of an indirect way by looking at what happens in the effect of increasing spending in one state versus another state, or one region versus another region. But as we worked on the project more, what we found is that there's sort of an important advantage of looking at this state or region level data. And the reason is that when you look at aggregate government spending, there's this difficulty that the effect of an increase in government spending is confounded by the policy response. So if you have a big increase in government spending, and it's not associated with anything that's going on with the business cycle, that's going to lead to an increase in output, an increase in inflation, and that in turn will lead to a response by monetary policy. So interest rates are going to go up. It might also lead to a response by tax policy, you know, because you have to pay for this spending, so tax rates are going to go up. So there's this great amount of sensitivity in terms of how much output is actually going to respond to an increase in government spending that's actually associated with the endogenous policy response, both fiscal policy and monetary policy. And the thing that we realized, this is one of these things that happens when you're working on research, sometimes you realize things that surprise you. The thing that we realized is that there's sort of an advantage of looking at this regional or cross-state analysis, which is that the monetary policy and the tax policy is in some sense being held fixed or constant. So what's the reason? Well, suppose we have an aggregate military buildup, which leads to much more spending in California than in Illinois. Well, the Fed can't raise interest rates in California relative to Illinois. And similarly, you know, military spending is paid for by national taxes, and similarly, the Treasury is not going to raise taxes in California versus Illinois. So in that sense, when we look at these relative multipliers, we have to be thinking about it as though we're looking at the effect of government spending in a very accommodative policy environment. So that is, in an environment where the increase in government spending is not bringing on a huge response in terms of interest rates and in terms of taxes. And so for that reason, when we think about the conclusions of what we found, so you know, we looked at this experiment where we thought about what happens when there's this aggregate military buildup. Well, it's going to lead to a change in relative spending in one state or one region versus the other, and then we're going to look at what happens to output in one place versus the other. We found that there was this pretty big effect, so a multiplier of something like 1.5. And then, you know, as I said, this sounds like a pretty big number. So your first response might be to think that's much more on the, you know, even pretty far in the Keynesian direction of what these multipliers might be. But the caveat is that because of the fact that the experiment is somewhat different, and we're really holding fixed the policy in the sense that the monetary policy and the fiscal policy is not responding in one state versus the other, you have to think about this as a multiplier for the case of very accommodative policy. So this is probably not a multiplier that applies for what you might call the normal policy environment, where an increase in output or an increase in inflation is probably going to be responded to with responses in terms of tax and monetary policy. But it is closer to the type of multiplier that you might expect when, for some reason, those things are not as responsive. And actually, the recent period, in some sense, is an example of that, right? Because we've hit this zero lower bound. So this is a situation, and this was, in fact, to some extent, the motivation for thinking about fiscal policy, where because of the fact that interest rates are stuck at zero, there isn't as much of a possibility for monetary policy to respond to other things that are happening in the economy. So what did we end up thinking? Well, we thought, well, this multiplier estimate that we found, it's sort of broadly consistent with the Keynesian view, but we want to think about it as the multiplier when fiscal and monetary policy is fairly accommodative. And so what we think this tells us is that the fiscal multiplier can be big in situations where monetary and tax policy are fairly unresponsive, but that the response is highly sensitive to those phenomena. And so this sort of broadly motivates the idea that if we want to think about government spending, how government spending affects the economy, that it makes sense to think about it differently in situations like the recent period, where, as I said, monetary policy was effectively stuck at the zero lower bound, than in situations where you might expect that the monetary and tax response is going to be much more substantial. Thank you.